The Toll-Keeper's Debt by Elowen Greaves, read by Elspeth Sauer. On the fourth day of her journey, just beyond a crooked turn in the old ridge road, Miss Hale found the bridge closed. She had left her hired trap some miles behind, opting to walk the remainder of the way to her cousin's estate. The autumn weather was crisp and dry, and she was in no hurry. The countryside, still remote in parts of Gloucestershire, suited her current state of mind. But this delay was unexpected. The bridge, such as it was, arched low over a narrow stream choked with reeds and dark water. 2 stone posts marked its entrance, green with lichen and deeply scored, perhaps by rains or wheels over generations. A crude iron gate had been chained across the way. There was no sign, no note of repair or caution. Miss Hale paused. The footpath leading down to the riverbank appeared to rejoin the road on the far side, a muddy arc of earth under the bridge itself. It did not look impassable. She had nearly stepped onto the downward slope when she saw the figure. He stood some distance beyond the bridge, in the hollow between 2 low hills, just where the road resumed. He was tall, or at least gave that impression, with a heavy coat that hung to the knee, and what looked like an oilskin cap pulled low over his brow. At first, she thought him merely a traveller, but he did not move. His posture was too still, neither expectant nor idle, but fixed. Miss Hale hesitated. The man made no gesture, no call. He did not turn away. And then the oddest detail impressed itself upon her. He held one hand out, palm upward, as though waiting for something to be placed in it. The gesture was unmistakable, and yet oddly formal, neither beckoning nor threatening, simply expectant. The hand, pale against the darker fabric of his coat, remained suspended at chest height, as though caught in some ceremonial moment left unfinished. Miss Hale stood for a long breath, uncertain. The air had grown curiously still. The usual rustle of leaves dampened, even though the trees lining the road swayed gently in a faint breeze. It was not fear that stayed her, but a kind of instinctive caution. The man's posture held the quality of something rehearsed, as though he were not waiting for her specifically, but rather for anyone, or everyone, who might pass. After another moment, she chose the simplest path. "I've no coin for toll," she called, lifting her voice across the short distance. The man made no reply, nor did his posture shift. The hand remained extended. Miss Hale felt a slight chill rise along the nape of her neck. The road was empty behind her for miles. The hour had drawn later than she realised. She was alone on the ridge. Deciding that this delay need not become an impasse, she withdrew a small silver 6pence from her reticule, a coin meant for incidental gratuities on her arrival. She stepped forward slowly, mindful of the soft, uncertain ground near the stream's edge, and crossed the narrow footpath beneath the bridge's arch. The water murmured faintly below, though its voice was strangely muted. Reaching the far side, she approached within a dozen paces of the waiting figure. The man did not move, nor did he speak. The hand remained extended. With deliberate calm, she placed the 6pence upon the outstretched palm. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, almost imperceptibly, the hand lowered, closing over the coin with a slow finality. The figure nodded once, stiffly, and turned without sound, disappearing into the low mist that pooled beyond the hollow's edge. The entire encounter had taken less than a minute. Miss Hale exhaled, surprised at the tension she had not fully realised she was holding, and resumed her walk along the road. But as she passed the place where the man had stood, she noticed something peculiar. There were no footprints, not his, not hers, only smooth, undisturbed earth, as though no one had walked that way in some time. The remaining miles passed without incident, though Miss Hale found herself glancing backward more often than reason dictated. The ridge road curved gently away behind her, offering no sign of the figure, nor of any approaching traveller. The countryside resumed its quiet indifference, the sun low and watery through thinning clouds. By the time she reached her cousin's house, a modest but well-maintained manor set back among the beech trees, night was pressing at the edges of the fields. Lamps glowed faintly behind thick leaded windows, and the gravel drive crunched pleasantly beneath her boots. Her cousin, Mrs. Francis Pelham, greeted her warmly at the door, expressing both relief and mild reproach at Miss Hale's decision to walk such a distance alone. "The trap might have waited," Francis chided, ushering her into the front hall where the smell of beeswax and peat mingled comfortingly. "I wanted the air," Margaret replied, removing her gloves. "And besides, I met no one, save for one curious fellow near a closed bridge." Francis looked up from the tray of tea that had been laid. "Closed bridge? The old toll crossing, do you mean?" "Yes. There was a gate chained across it. I took the lower path and came upon a man. He seemed to be waiting for payment. I gave him a sixpence." At this, Francis frowned slightly, setting the teapot down with care. "That crossing hasn't been used in years, not since the floods washed out the lower road. The toll house itself was torn down before my time." Margaret blinked, unsettled but unwilling to seem fanciful. "I'm quite sure of what I saw. He was dressed plainly, but nothing to suggest he was out of place." Francis hesitated, as though weighing her next words. "It's only, well, you may hear people here speak of that bridge, especially the older families. They say the toll keeper kept collecting long after he ought." She smiled faintly, attempting to soften the thought. "Local colour, you understand." Margaret returned the smile, though the faint chill from the hollow lingered at her back. "Of course," she said softly. "Local colour." But later, as she dressed for supper, she noticed something else. The coin purse within her reticule, though properly closed, held precisely the number of coins it had before her walk. The sixpence was there, still resting among its fellows, cool and untouched. At first, Margaret questioned her own recollection. Had she perhaps withdrawn a different coin? Had she, in the odd stillness of that encounter, imagined giving it at all? Yet the memory remained fixed, the pale hand extended, the distinct feel of placing the sixpence onto the open palm, the slow closing of the fingers. The detail would not blur or diminish, no matter how much she attempted to examine it from different angles of reason. That evening, seated with Francis before the drawing-room fire, she gently steered their conversation back toward the subject. "This old tale of the toll-keeper," Margaret said, lifting her cup. "Is there more to it? The housekeeper mentioned something earlier, but seemed reluctant to elaborate." Francis hesitated, glancing toward the door as if to ensure they remained unheard. "It's an old business," she said finally, "from my grandfather's time, or earlier. The causeway was dangerous even then, prone to flooding. Travellers spoke of being stopped after dark, of being charged twice, or paying when no collector should have been present." Margaret listened quietly. The logs shifted softly in the grate. "After one such flood," Francis continued, "they found the toll-keeper's body washed into the reeds downstream. It was said he had refused to leave his post, despite the rising waters. Some thought he'd been drinking. Others said—" She paused. "Others said he lingered because certain debts had not been properly balanced." "What sort of debts?" Francis gave a thin, almost embarrassed smile. "The usual village whispers. Old transactions, owed payments, superstitions about reckoning one's last accounts before death. You know how such things accumulate." Margaret nodded. "And yet they still speak of him." "Not often, but yes, now and then, particularly when someone sees him." She met Margaret's gaze then, her tone light, but her eyes serious. "Always the same description. A man who stands waiting, hand out, but who takes nothing that stays taken." Margaret did not reply. The coin purse in her room weighed oddly in her mind, heavier than its contents could explain. That night, as she extinguished the lamp and slipped into bed, the house seemed unusually quiet. But far off, carried faintly through the window on the rising wind, she thought she heard the faint clink of coin against coin, repeating softly, like a hand idly weighing small silver in its palm. The days that followed passed outwardly without anything of remark. Margaret accompanied Francis on walks about the estate, spoke politely with the vicar during his weekly call, and even attended a small gathering hosted by a neighbouring family. The countryside, with its low hills and crumbling stone walls, presented the tranquil charm of late autumn. But beneath this surface normalcy, the weight of that brief encounter remained fixed in her mind. Small things began to disturb her, not outright omens, but quiet intrusions that seemed to press against her attention at odd hours. Twice she awoke in the night to the distinct impression that someone had passed through her chamber. No sound had roused her, no movement met her waking eye, but the cold imprint of presence lingered like breath upon glass. On another occasion, while writing at the small desk in her guest room, she became aware of a faint rhythm beneath the scratch of her pen, a soft counting, almost a whisper, as though someone nearby recited numbers in steady succession. When she paused to listen directly, it ceased. One afternoon, as the two women sat together embroidering by the tall parlour window, Frances ventured cautiously, "You've seemed unsettled these past few days." Margaret smiled faintly, lowering her needle. A little restless, perhaps. New surroundings, old stories. Frances hesitated, glancing toward the empty fireplace before continuing, her voice lower. "If you find yourself troubled, Margaret, you mustn't feel you need to. Rationalise everything." She gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "Not in this part of the country." Margaret appreciated the kindness behind the words, but chose not to speak of the growing sense that something still followed her from the crossing. That night, the pattern shifted again. Shortly after midnight, Margaret woke sharply, with no clear reason for her stirring. The air in the room felt colder than before, though no window was open. At the far end of the chamber, near the foot of the wardrobe, stood the figure. It was not shadow, nor trick of moonlight. The pale hand was unmistakable, outstretched once again, palm upward, expectant. The face was obscured beneath the brim of the cap, just as it had been upon the road. The heavy coat hung about the frame, motionless. But now, in the closeness of the room, Margaret saw something she had not observed before. Along the edges of the coat, the fabric was darkly stained, as though long soaked through by water, and beneath the brim of the cap, where flesh should have shown, there was only a grey pallor like wax, left too long in dampness. The hand did not waver. Margaret sat upright, pulse pounding, but did not cry out. Her voice, when it came, was thin but steady. "I have nothing for you." At this, the hand closed slowly, folding into a fist. The figure withdrew, not turning but receding backward into the shadows of the room's far corner, until the gloom swallowed it entirely. Only then did Margaret feel her limbs release their frozen hold. The chamber's cold eased, as though the air itself exhaled. But she knew, with cold certainty, that the toll had not yet been paid. Morning brought no evidence that the encounter had been anything but dream, yet Margaret knew otherwise. The lingering chill remained, as did the sharp clarity of the figure's appearance, too precise, too detailed for any ordinary vision of sleep. She descended to breakfast, pale but composed. Frances, perhaps sensing her mood, spoke little. Their conversation stayed firmly upon matters of menus, correspondence, and the weather's slow turn toward frost. That afternoon, Margaret ventured into the village alone. She asked, gently and indirectly, about the bridge, phrasing her questions as the idle curiosity of a visitor with an interest in local history. The older villagers were forthcoming, though wary in their manner. "That road's never been right since old Hambley drowned," said one farmer, glancing sidelong toward the misted hills beyond. "Kept his post too long, some said. Wasn't just the rain. He wouldn't leave, even when warned." Another, an elderly woman seated before the grocer's window, offered a sharper tale. "They say he'd taken coin from those who shouldn't have crossed. Fugitives, soldiers gone to desert, smugglers. Blood money it was. Thought himself clever. Thought no one would count the tolls but him. But debts paid unjustly have a way of lingering." When Margaret asked, carefully, whether others had seen him since, the woman nodded once, gravely. "Not many, but when he's seen it's always the same. He asks, though not with words. And if you pay him—" She paused, lowering her voice. "You'll find you've kept your coin, because it's not payment he wants. It's balance." Margaret felt a cold weight settle more firmly in her chest. As she returned to the manor, the low winter sun dipped behind the hills, and long shadows reached across the frozen ground, like fingers stretching toward the road. That night, she prepared herself. At the small writing desk in her chamber, she placed her coin purse upon the blotter, opening it carefully. The sixpence lay atop the others, its edge gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Margaret withdrew the coin and set it before her, then paused, considering. An instinct stirred, a memory of the phrase spoken in the village. It's not payment he wants, it's balance. Reaching again into the purse, she drew out a second sixpence and placed it beside the first. 2 coins, one for the toll taken unjustly, one for the toll unpaid. Then she waited. The room's quiet deepened as midnight approached. The small clock on the mantel ticked faintly, and as the hour passed into its final stroke, the air in the room thickened once more. The corner darkened, and from the shadows, the toll-keeper stepped forward. The figure emerged with the same dreadful steadiness as before, neither hurried nor hesitant. The coat still hung heavy, its sodden hem darkening the floorboards where it passed. Beneath the brim of his cap, his face remained largely hidden, though now Margaret caught glimpses of the slack pallor beneath, flesh, waxy and sunken, as though long submerged. He halted several paces from her desk, just as before, and raised the hand. The pale palm glowed faintly in the lamplight, open, patient, expectant. But Margaret did not move at once. She met the hollow gaze, or rather the space where eyes ought to have been, and spoke softly, her voice more steady than she had expected. "These are not coins for passage," she said. "They are coins for debt." The toll-keeper gave no sign of comprehension or objection. The hand remained extended. Margaret reached forward and placed the 2 coins, one by one, into the open palm. The fingers closed over them slowly, with a finality that seemed somehow quieter than silence itself. For a long moment, the figure stood motionless, as though weighing the offering not by its substance, but by its sufficiency. Then, very slowly, the toll-keeper lowered his arm. His head dipped in the barest nod, an acknowledgement not of gratitude, but of settlement. The air in the room shifted, as though some unseen tension slackened. The cold receded. The shadowed corner brightened imperceptibly as the figure began to withdraw, backward as before, his heavy coat drawing after him, like the trailing edge of a receding tide. And then he was gone. The room held its breath for a moment longer, before releasing it into the ordinary quiet of the sleeping house. Margaret sat very still, her hands resting upon the blotter, and allowed herself a single long breath. When she finally rose to extinguish the lamp, the coins were no longer upon the desk. Nor, when she checked the purse the next morning, did they remain there. The debt, whatever its nature, had been paid.